What if I told you that everything you think you know about the Middle Ages is wrong? That the peasants weren't always filthy, that witch hunts barely existed, and that some of the strangest practices in history happened not in dark alleys, but in bright daylight, supported by kings, priests, and scholars. This is the world of medieval Europe, where medicine bled, you dry, justice was decided by fire, and water animals stood trial like humans, and the sky itself could spark wars. And trust me, the real stories are far more disturbing than the myths. Stick around, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear will make you grateful you weren't born in the medieval world. We tend to imagine the Middle Ages as a time of superstition and ignorance. Hollywood shows peasants hiding from priests, witches burned on pyres, and knights living by some glorious code of honor. But peel back the romantic layers, and you'll find something much more unsettling: a civilization trying desperately to make sense of a chaotic world using ideas that today would sound insane, but back then were unquestionable truth. Between the fall of Rome in 476 CE and the rise of the Renaissance in 1453, Europe lived through nearly 1,000 years of uncertainty. Plagues swept entire kingdoms, wars erased dynasties overnight, and famine stalked the countryside. In such a fragile world, people clung to any system, no matter how bizarre, that promised answers. Medicine, law, religion, and even parenting all became experiments in survival, often with tragic results. Let's start with the so-called science of healing. For over 700 years, doctors believed the human body was governed by 4 humors: blood phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Too much of one, they thought, caused illness. The cure: drain it out. If you felt sick, they opened your veins. If you had fever, they summoned leeches. If you were weak, they cut until your strength poured into bowls. In their eyes, this wasn't madness. It was medicine. The method was simple but chilling. A physician would take a sharp lancet, slice a vein in your arm, and calmly watch your life force drip away. In wealthier towns, glass cups were heated and placed against the skin, sucking blood through the surface as the hot glass cooled. Imagine lying there dizzy, watching your own blood gather in a vessel, while a doctor smiled with confidence, convinced this was the path to health. Even worse, sometimes it seemed to work, at least for a moment. Lowering blood pressure could reduce a fever, making the patient feel briefly better. This illusion kept the practice alive for centuries. Kings, nobles, and even popes submitted to it. King Charles II of England, during a stroke in 1685, was drained of nearly 2 pints of blood. He never recovered. George Washington himself, centuries later in 1799, lost almost 40% of his blood in less than a day for a simple throat infection, and died not from the illness but from the cure. The tragedy is staggering. Generations of Europeans trusted their best doctors, their most educated scholars, and in return they were weakened, crippled, or killed. Entire families watched loved ones fade under the weight of treatments that drained their life away. It wasn't a barbarian superstition. It was university-taught science spread from Italy's medical schools to France, England, and beyond. To be sick in medieval Europe often meant you had to survive both your disease and your doctor. By the 19th century, medicine finally began to shift. Doctors realized bloodletting was killing far more people than it saved. But by then, countless lives had already been lost. Bloodletting stands as one of history's darkest reminders that even well-intentioned knowledge can destroy when it's based on error. And this was only the beginning. Because if medicine could betray, so too could justice. You've heard the stories of witches burning at the stake of peasants dragged from their homes for supposed black magic. But here's the truth that will shock you. Real witch hunts barely existed in the medieval era. The image of torch-wielding mobs and screaming villagers, that was propaganda invented later. In fact, the Catholic Church of the early Middle Ages often dismissed witchcraft as pagan nonsense, unworthy of punishment. It was the enlightened Renaissance and Reformation, centuries later, that unleashed the true madness. Between 1550 and 1650, long after the medieval period had ended, Protestant regions, especially in Germany and Scotland, went berserk with witch executions. Entire towns descended into paranoia. In Würzburg and Bamberg, Catholic bishops under Protestant influence burned hundreds in just a few years. King James VI of Scotland even wrote a book on how to hunt witches before ruling England. The irony is staggering. The era most remembered for witch burning, the Middle Ages, barely saw it. It was so-called enlightened Europe that turned fear into a furnace. But if witch hunts were not the main horror of medieval justice, then what was? The real nightmare lay in something even more twisted: trial by ordeal. When evidence was lacking, courts turned to torture, believing God himself would reveal the truth. If you were innocent, the Almighty would protect you. If you were guilty, suffering would expose you. That was the logic. Terrifyingly simple and devastatingly cruel. Picture this: an accused man handed a glowing hot iron bar, forced to carry it 9 feet barefoot. His hands were then wrapped and sealed for 3 days. If the wounds healed cleanly, he was declared innocent by divine miracle. If they festered or grew infected, he was guilty and doomed. Entire villages gathered to watch, as if the hands of heaven would visibly intervene. Or, imagine being tied up, thrown into a pond, and left at the mercy of cold water. Sink beneath the surface and drown, you were innocent but dead. Float to the top, buoyed by your bonds, and the court declared you guilty of rejecting holy water itself. Either way, the accused rarely walked away alive. It was a cruel catch-22 dressed as justice. Then came boiling water ordeals. A thief might be ordered to plunge his hand wrist deep into scalding water to retrieve a stone. For greater crimes, he had to reach in up to his elbow. The burns told the story if they healed innocence, if they festered guilt. In reality, the only certainty was agony. Priests stood by, solemnly blessing the process as if pain alone could summon divine truth. What made these ordeals so chilling wasn't only the physical suffering, but how they broke the mind. Innocent people terrified of fire iron and water confessed to crimes they never committed just to avoid facing the test. It was plea bargaining by terror centuries before modern law invented courts and juries. Fear itself became the greatest executioner. Eventually, even the Church recoiled. In 1215, Pope Innocent III banned priests from participating in ordeals, stripping the rituals of their divine legitimacy. With no holy blessing, the system collapsed. But by then, for 4 centuries, thousands of men and women had been condemned not by evidence but by their ability to endure pain. It is a reminder that in the Middle Ages, truth was not discovered, it was burned, drowned, and scarred into existence. And if you think justice couldn't get stranger, wait until you hear what happened when animals were put on trial. Yes, you heard that right. Pigs, cows, mice, even beetles stood accused before medieval courts. They were assigned lawyers judged by human standards and sometimes executed in public squares. This was not a one-off oddity, it was a system. Take the case of a pig in Falaise, France, 1386. It killed a child and the court treated it like a murderer. The pig was dressed in human clothes, gloves on its hooves, a jacket on its back, and hanged before a crowd. Records show the town even paid for the outfit, as if mocking the line between beast and man. For the medieval mind, if an animal committed a human crime, it deserved a human punishment, and it didn't stop at pigs. In 1519, mice were put on trial in France for destroying crops. Because the animals couldn't appear in person, the court appointed a defense lawyer who argued his clients were too young to understand the law and simply seeking food as God intended. In Switzerland, beetle larvae were summoned, failed to appear, and were sentenced in absentia. Absurd, to us, yes, but to medieval society it was moral order. For more than 4 centuries, animal trials continued across Europe, fueled by the belief that every creature had a soul and could choose between good and evil. Domestic animals faced harsher sentences because they should have known better. Wild creatures were judged more leniently, acting on instinct. The bizarre fusion of theology and law blurred the boundaries of justice, turning barns and fields into potential crime scenes. But perhaps nowhere was medieval misunderstanding more tragic than in the way parents cared for their children. They loved their babies no less than we do today, yet their methods often doomed them. Between 20 and 50% of medieval children never saw their 5th birthday, many not because of malice but because of misinformed love. Wealthy families entrusted infants to wet nurses, but the selection process was bizarre. Doctors claimed a woman's character passed through her milk. A nurse who was virtuous would produce moral children. A nurse with fiery passions could poison a baby's temperament. Some even insisted that blonde hair made milk healthier. Science numbers superstition disguised as wisdom. Examinations of milk were disturbingly meticulous. Physicians dropped a bead of milk on a fingernail too thick, and the nurse was deemed too lustful. Too thin, and she was thought weak-willed. Imagine being judged not only for your virtue, but for the texture of the milk you produced. To medieval society, the fate of a child's soul and body rested on such absurd rituals. For poorer families, there was no choice. Lacking wet nurses, they fed infants concoctions of water honey and, shockingly, wine. Doctors swore alcohol would strengthen fragile bodies. Babies sipped bread soaked in ale or cow's milk mixed with herbs that were often toxic. Every gulp a slow poisoning given with the purest intentions. And then there was swaddling. Infants were bound so tightly in strips of cloth they could barely move, immobilized like tiny mummies. Parents feared loose limbs would grow crooked, so they trapped their babies' bodies for months. Many infants developed breathing problems, circulation issues, and permanent damage before they ever learned to walk. Hygiene was no better. Water was thought dangerous for tender skin, so baths were rare. Instead, parents rubbed babies with salt or wine to cleanse them, believing pain meant purification. Dirty diapers were left unchanged for days, as frequent cleaning was said to weaken a child's spirit. The result, infections spread faster than love could protect. Medical advice made matters worse. Teething children had their gums rubbed with honey mixed with animal fat. Colicky infants were given opium syrups that stopped their cries, sometimes forever. To desperate parents, silence seemed like healing. In truth, it was a fatal lullaby. Religion also played its part. Sick babies were pressed against relics and icons, exposing them to germs from countless other sufferers. Pilgrimages to holy shrines dragged fragile infants into crowded gatherings where disease spread like wildfire, all in the hope that divine power might succeed where medicine failed. What makes these tragedies unbearable is that they were born of love, not neglect. Parents prayed, sacrificed, and followed every piece of advice their age offered. Yet their trust in false remedies turned nurseries into graveyards. So common was infant death that many parents delayed naming their children until they survived the first year. Life itself was uncertain, a fragile candle flickering against the wind. Only in the late Middle Ages did mortality begin to decline as hygiene slowly improved and medical knowledge edged forward. But for centuries, childhood in Europe was less a stage of innocence and more a survival lottery. And just as the private sphere of family was marked by danger, so too was the public sphere of cleanliness. Because what you've heard about filthy medieval peasants is another great myth. We grow up imagining medieval people as permanently filthy, coated in mud, afraid of water. But the truth flips the stereotype upside down. In the early Middle Ages, Europeans bathed far more often than we think. Cities like Paris boasted dozens of public bathhouses buzzing with life steam and laughter. For a while, cleanliness was a civic duty and even a spiritual practice. These bathhouses weren't crude wooden tubs in dark corners. They were lively centers of social gathering, complete with hot and cold pools, steam rooms, and attendants. Monks followed strict rules of hygiene washing before prayers, and monasteries built sophisticated drainage systems. The rule of Saint Benedict required frequent bathing. Clean bodies symbolized clean souls. Even peasants had access to soap made from ash and animal fat, while the wealthy enjoyed perfumed soaps infused with herbs. Private bathing chambers in noble households included large wooden tubs filled with hot water by servants. Imagine a medieval noble soaking in scented baths, not unlike modern spa culture centuries before the stereotype of filth took root. But everything changed with the arrival of the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, plague ravaged Europe, killing up to 60% of the population. Survivors were terrified, desperate to find a cause. Doctors claimed water opened the pores, inviting bad air and disease into the body. The bathhouse, once a place of health, became a house of death in the public imagination. By 1400, many cities shut down their communal baths. Fear overtook reason. Instead of washing, people embraced what they called dry cleaning, changing linen shirts, frequently believing the fabric absorbed dirt and disease. White linen became the ultimate status symbol. The cleaner the shirt, the cleaner the person, or so they thought. Perfumes and powders became substitutes for water. Wealthy men drenched themselves in exotic fragrances imported from distant lands. Women carried pomanders, spheres filled with aromatic herbs to ward off foul smells. Hygiene became about masking odors rather than eliminating them. Ironically, the Renaissance and early modern period, not the Middle Ages, created the dirty Europe that still haunts our imagination. Hair care followed the same strange path. With bathing out of fashion, men hid greasy locks under hats, while women concealed unwashed hair beneath elaborate headdresses and wigs. Monthly washing was considered sufficient. A culture that once valued water as purification now treated it as poison. The irony deepens when we look at archaeology. Excavations reveal medieval towns with drainage systems, latrines placed away from wells, and spaces specifically for washing. Soap production was regulated by guilds ensuring quality. The supposed Dark Age of filth was in many ways more sanitary than what came after. Fear, not ignorance, destroyed cleanliness. The myth of the filthy peasant was born, later crafted by Renaissance elites and Victorian historians who wanted to cast themselves as more civilized than their ancestors. In reality, medieval people were fighting a battle we still recognize today: how to balance health fear and faith in the face of deadly disease. They didn't always get it right, but their downfall wasn't dirt, it was terror. And terror took another form in the most public stage of all executions. Forget solemn justice or quiet punishment. Medieval executions were festivals. They were carnivals of death with food stalls, crowds of thousands, and children watching as criminals met gruesome ends. For 800 years, Europe turned human suffering into its most popular public entertainment. Execution days were like holidays. Markets shut down, schools closed, and entire towns poured into the square. Vendors sold bread ale and roasted meat. Pickpockets prowled the crowd. Families brought children believing the spectacle was moral education. Justice wasn't hidden, it was paraded like a festival. Different crimes demanded different spectacles. Thieves dangled from ropes, nobles were beheaded, heretics burned, and traitors endured elaborate tortures. Each method was chosen not just to kill, but to display. Death was theater, and the condemned were unwilling actors. Take William Wallace in 1305. The Scottish rebel was hanged until nearly dead, cut down, disemboweled alive. His organs burned before his eyes, then beheaded and quartered. The crowd roared at every stage as though watching sport. Brutality became entertainment, and entertainment justified brutality. Executioners became celebrities. A skilled headsman who ended life with one clean stroke was admired. A clumsy one needing several swings was booed and sometimes attacked. Audiences demanded quality even in death. To them, justice wasn't only about law, it was about performance. Souvenirs were big business. Pieces of rope from hangings sold as lucky charms. Executioners auctioned off the clothes of the condemned. Relics from famous deaths, real or fake, changed hands like holy objects. Justice fed not only fear, but also commerce. For heretics, burning at the stake was especially popular. Fire turned punishment into prolonged theater. Joan of Arc's death drew enormous crowds who came not to mourn, but to watch what they believed was divine wrath in action. The smell of burning flesh mixed with laughter, food, and prayer. Children weren't shielded, they were encouraged to watch. Schools organized trips to hangings. Parents told their sons and daughters, "See this, and you will never become criminals." Fear and fascination grew together, weaving violence into the fabric of daily life. Crowds didn't just watch, they participated. Some hurled rotten food at criminals, others cheered, or even tried to rescue the condemned if they were popular. Public justice was messy, loud, and communal. It wasn't meant to be private punishment, but a spectacle of morality. Only in the 18th and 19th centuries did Europe begin to recoil. Ideas of dignity, decency, and reform slowly pushed executions behind prison walls. But for nearly 8 centuries, Europeans treated death as their grandest theater, a carnival of cruelty disguised as civic duty. And cruelty wasn't confined to the gallows. Even the church turned sin into commerce. Salvation had a price tag. For the right amount of money, you could buy forgiveness not in metaphor but in actual written certificates. This was the infamous trade of indulgences, a system that blurred the line between faith and financial fraud. From the 14th to the 16th century, the church perfected indulgences into a spiritual marketplace. Pay a day's wages and your minor sins were cleared. Pay months of income and you could wipe your soul clean. For nobles and merchants, salvation became a luxury product. The logic was terrifyingly persuasive. The church claimed to possess a treasury of merit excess good deeds from Christ and the saints that could be transferred to ordinary sinners. In other words, heaven had a bank account and priests held the key. All you needed was coin. Salesmen traveled across Europe, setting up stalls in marketplaces like insurance agents of the soul. Johann Tetzel, one notorious peddler, shouted his slogan, "As soon as the coin in the coffer rings the soul from purgatory springs, fear became a sales pitch and eternity a commodity." You could even buy indulgences for the dead. Parents purchased them for deceased children, hoping to shorten their suffering. Some indulgences covered future sins, spiritual credit cards that let you sin first and pay later. Imagine believing you could prepay your way out of hell. Different sins carried different prices. Murder demanded more than theft. Adultery was premium. Bulk discounts existed for families or guilds. It was moral accounting complete with rate sheets, and the more you feared purgatory, the more you paid. Money poured into Rome, funding crusades, palaces, and St. Peter's Basilica. The faithful thought they were buying holiness. In reality, they financed papal wars and Renaissance luxuries. Forgiveness flowed upward. Gold flowed into the Vatican. The scam eventually reached breaking point. Martin Luther, outraged by Tetzel's campaigns, nailed his 95 Theses in 1517. His protest against indulgences ignited the Protestant Reformation, shattering the unity of Western Christianity. A spiritual money laundering scheme had set Europe ablaze, but indulgences were only one form of medieval fear. Look upward, and the sky itself was a source of terror. Eclipses, comets, and strange lights weren't seen as natural phenomena. They were divine telegrams of doom, messages from God, warning of death, war, or the end of the world. In 1133, a solar eclipse plunged England into panic. 2 years later, King Henry I died, and chroniclers swore the eclipse had foretold it. In 1066, Halley's comet blazed before the Norman invasion of England. To the Saxons, it meant disaster. To the Normans, divine approval. The same comet became a prophecy fulfilled in blood. Astrologers thrived in royal courts. These weren't street magicians, but educated scholars who combined astronomy with prophecy. Kings delayed treaties and wars until the heavens aligned. In 1456, Pope Calixtus III even excommunicated a comet ringing church bells across Europe to ward off its devilish influence. Even lunar eclipses terrified medieval villagers. They believed demons or dragons were devouring the moon. Entire communities banged pots, rang bells, and shouted into the night sky to scare away invisible monsters. The heavens weren't silent, they were alive with omens. Auroras, rarely seen in southern Europe, sparked mass hysteria. When the northern lights blazed red in 1204, chroniclers described them as armies of angels fighting above the clouds. To medieval eyes, every flicker of light was a battle between salvation and damnation. Even regular planetary alignments caused panic. Great conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn were interpreted as cosmic emergencies. Kings delayed marriages and wars waiting for the right stars. The sky itself was a courtroom and every constellation a verdict. But sometimes the verdict was decided not by stars nor priests, but by blood. Trial by combat turned courts into gladiator arenas. When evidence failed, men fought to the death, and the winner was declared innocent because surely God would grant victory to the righteous. The most famous case came in France. 1386, Jean de Carouge accused Jacques Legris of assaulting his wife. With no proof, the king ordered a judicial duel. Before, thousands of spectators' swords clashed, horses fell, and lives hung on the edge of steel. If Carouge's lost, his wife would burn for false testimony. If he won, her honor was restored. In the end, Carouge's killed Legris, and divine justice, at least in the eyes of the crowd, was satisfied. But was it God's will, or simply one man's strength? For 6 centuries, such duels were sanctioned across Europe. Nobles, commoners, even women through male champions fought under the banner of justice. It wasn't evidence that decided guilt. It was muscle skill and sometimes sheer luck. Justice had a sword's edge, but the flaws became impossible to ignore. Wealthy defendants hired professional champions. Innocent but weak men perished. Guilty but skilled fighters walked free. Gradually, the church and legal scholars abandoned the illusion that God swung the sword. By the 15th century, the practice faded into memory. Looking back, the Middle Ages weren't simply an age of darkness. They were an age of desperate experiments of people trying to understand life, death, and justice with the tools they had. Medicine killed as often as it cured. Justice tortured as often as it protected. Faith sold salvation even as it preached humility. And yet behind it all was one constant: the human need to find meaning in chaos. The real lesson isn't that medieval people were cruel or foolish. It's that every age carries its blind spots, its dangerous certainties. Someday, future generations may look at our own medical practices, our technologies, even our laws, with the same horror we feel about bloodletting or trial by combat. History whispers a warning. What seems normal now may one day be remembered as madness. So, What shocked you most today, and which of our modern customs do you think the future will condemn? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe, because the strangest truths of history are only just beginning.